July 24th, 1943. Deep in the contested waters of the Pacific, a promise is about to be broken. Aboard the submarine USS Tinosa, Lieutenant Commander Lawrence Daspit is holding his breath. For a submariner, this is the moment legends are made of, the kind of moment you train your entire life for. In his periscope sights is the prize of a lifetime. The Tonan Maru III, a colossal Japanese whale factory ship converted into a tanker. At 19,000 tons, she isn't just a ship, she's a floating fuel depot, a critical artery pumping the lifeblood of war into the Japanese Imperial Navy. Taking her down wouldn't just be a victory, it would be a crippling blow. The setup is perfect. It's more than perfect. It's a textbook execution, the kind instructors dream about. Daspit and his crew have stalked their prey with masterful patience, slipping past enemy destroyers to position themselves at an ideal range and angle. The complex torpedo data computer, the mechanical brain of the submarine, confirms a 100% firing solution. There is no guesswork. There is no chance of error. In the tense, sweat-slicked confines of the control room, every man knows this is it. They are about to make history. Daspit gives the order. Fire 1. The submarine shudders as the first torpedo is ejected. Fire 2. Another shudder. One after another. 15. Mark 14 torpedoes. 15 sleek, 21-foot promises of American industrial might are sent racing toward the unsuspecting giant. Each one cost the American taxpayer $10,000, a staggering sum at the time. But in this moment, they are priceless instruments of war, the great equalizers of the deep. The sonar operator begins his count, his voice a steady drumbeat against the thumping hearts of the crew. He calls out the impacts, each one a sharp, metallic ping ringing through the hull. 1 hit, 2, 5, 8. A total of 11 solid impacts are confirmed. A wave of triumphant energy electrifies the crew. Men clap each other on the back, their faces lit with the fierce grin of success. 11 hits on a target of this size, at this range? It's unthinkable. It's unprecedented. The Tonan Maru should be tearing itself apart, erupting in a chain of catastrophic fireballs. Daspit allows himself a rare smile, picturing the enemy vessel's death throes. But as he keeps his eye glued to the periscope, the celebration dies in his throat. The expected column of fire and smoke never comes. The sound of rending steel, of a dying ship, is absent. Instead, there is only the rhythmic chugging of the tanker's engines, continuing on its course, almost arrogantly unharmed. The crew falls silent, their cheers turning to confused whispers. What they hear next, through the sensitive hydrophones, is a sound that will haunt them for the rest of their lives. It's not the thunderous roar of an explosion, but a series of dull, sickening thuds, the hollow clank of hardened steel striking steel, and then nothing. 9 of their torpedoes, 9 of their precision-engineered weapons, had struck the enemy and failed to detonate. They were duds. Out of 11 confirmed hits, only 2 had actually exploded, and their detonations were so feeble they barely scratched the tanker's paint. The Tonan Maru III, wounded but alive, steams away, leaving the USS Tinosa wallowing in a sea of disbelief and impotent rage. This single event was not an anomaly. It was a symptom of a catastrophic disease that had been plaguing America's submarine fleet for 21 agonizing months. The Mark 14 torpedo, lauded as the most advanced and lethal weapon of its kind, was a lie. This wasn't just an equipment malfunction. This was the epicenter of one of the greatest military scandals in American history. A quiet, desperate war, fought not against the Japanese, but against a broken weapon and an unyielding bureaucracy thousands of miles away in Washington, D.C. It was a war of faith against fact, of frontline experience against armchair theory. And it was a war where the currency of failure was measured in the lives of American sailors. How could this happen? How could a nation that put the automobile in every driveway and was on the verge of splitting the atom produce a weapon that worked only 20% of the time? This story isn't just about a faulty torpedo. It's about the staggering cost of arrogance, the price of refusing to listen to the men on the front lines, and the moral courage of one man who dared to defy the system to find the truth. In the crushing silence of his failed attack, Commander DEFIED is consumed by a cold fury. He had done everything right. His men had performed flawlessly. They had been betrayed by their own weapon. He makes a decision born of pure frustration. He has one torpedo left. He will not fire it. Instead, he will bring it home. That single, inert torpedo, still nestled in its tube, was no longer a weapon. It was evidence. He didn't know it yet, but this silent steel fish would become the most important piece of ordnance in the Pacific War. The catalyst for an impossible investigation, a quiet rebellion, and the one thing that could finally force the Navy to confront its own disastrous failure. To understand the depth of the betrayal felt by Commander DEFIED and his crew, you first have to understand the legend of the Mark 14. This wasn't just another piece of hardware in the US Navy's arsenal. It was a promise. It was a symbol. Back in the United States, the Mark 14 was considered the pinnacle of naval engineering, a technological masterpiece that had been secretly developed and perfected for nearly 2 decades. It was America's silver bullet, the weapon that would guarantee submarine supremacy in the Pacific. Its design was a quantum leap beyond the steam-powered torpedoes of World War I, running on a clean, wakeless electric propulsion system that made it nearly invisible as it sliced through the water. At the heart of this marvel was its most classified and celebrated feature, the Mark 6 exploder. This ingenious device was a dual-system trigger. It had a standard contact detonator, designed to go off when the torpedo physically slammed into the side of a ship. But it also had something revolutionary, a magnetic influence fuse. This fuse was designed to detect the magnetic field of a ship's hull, allowing the torpedo to run underneath the target and detonate, breaking the ship's keel. A broken keel was a death sentence for any vessel, far more effective than simply punching a hole in its side. In theory, it was the perfect ship killer. The guardians of this technology, the high priests of its doctrine, were the men of the Navy's Bureau of Ordnance, or BUORD, operating from the Naval Torpedo Station in Newport, Rhode Island. They were thousands of miles removed from the gritty reality of the Pacific War. They were brilliant engineers, physicists, and administrators. But they operated in a world of blueprints, calculations, and controlled environments. For them, the Mark 14 wasn't just a weapon. It was the culmination of their life's work. They had tested it, refined it, and declared it the finest torpedo in the world. Their confidence was absolute. Their word was gospel. And their gospel stated that the Mark 14 was flawless. This supreme confidence was reflected in the weapon's price tag. At $10,000 per unit, it was more expensive than a fighter plane. This cost created a powerful psychological barrier. The weapon was so valuable, so precious, that the idea of wasting one on a live fire test during the lean budget years of the Great Depression was deemed an unacceptable extravagance. And so, the Navy made a decision, a seemingly rational, fiscally responsible decision that would have catastrophic consequences. They decided to test the Mark 14 using dummy warheads filled with water instead of high explosives. These dummy heads were designed to be recovered after a test run, saving the Navy immense sums of money. Let that sink in. In its entire 2-decade development, the Mark 14 had never once been fired in a live fire test with a live warhead against a real target ship. All of its supposed perfection was based on theory and on tests that simulated only the torpedo's journey, not its ultimate, violent purpose. They tested if it could run straight. They tested if it could maintain its depth. But they never tested if it would actually explode under the brutal, unforgiving conditions of a real-world impact. The very thing the weapon was designed to do, destroy an enemy ship, was the one thing that was never verified. It was an oversight born of peacetime frugality and institutional arrogance. It made perfect sense on an accountant's spreadsheet in Washington. You save the cost of the torpedo, and you save the cost of a target ship. But war is not fought on a spreadsheet. A decision made to save thousands of dollars would eventually cost the nation billions in prolonged warfare, wasted resources, and an immeasurable price in the lives of its finest sailors. The men of the submarine service were being sent into the deadliest theater of the war, armed with a weapon whose effectiveness was based entirely on faith. And as America reeled from the attack on Pearl Harbor, that faith was about to be shattered. The Mark 14, the pride of the Navy, was finally put to the ultimate test. Submariners, trained to believe they wielded the deadliest weapon beneath the waves, eagerly sailed into enemy waters, ready to exact a terrible price on the Japanese fleet. The first reports that began to trickle back to Pearl Harbor were not the triumphant tales of sunken carriers and cruisers that Buord expected. They were confused, frustrated whispers of perfect shots that resulted in nothing, of torpedoes that ran wild, and of enemy ships that sailed away unscathed. The gap between the promise of Newport and the reality of the Pacific was becoming a deadly chasm, and the whispers were about to become a roar. The sign of trouble was subtle, a persistent ghost in the machine that was hard to pin down. As early as December 1941, in the chaotic weeks following Pearl Harbor, submarine commanders began reporting a frustrating phenomenon. They would execute flawless attacks, firing their torpedoes at point-blank range, only to watch in disbelief as their targets sailed on, completely unscathed. The commanders were certain they hadn't missed. They could often hear the distinct sound of their torpedo running its course, passing directly beneath the enemy ship. The consensus was unsettling. The torpedoes were running deeper than their depth settings indicated. A torpedo set to run at 10 feet was actually running at 20 or 25 feet, passing harmlessly under the keel of its intended victim. These were not rookie skippers. They were seasoned veterans, the best the United States Navy had to offer. When they sent their reports back to the Bureau of Ordnance, they expected a serious investigation. What they got was condescension. Buord's response was swift, arrogant, and dismissive. The problem couldn't possibly be their perfect torpedo. The problem, they insisted, must be the men firing it. They issued letters to the fleet, attributing the failures to poor marksmanship, faulty calculations, and improper maintenance by the crew. They implied that the commanders, rattled by the stress of combat, were simply not as good as they thought they were. It was a staggering insult, a case of institutional gaslighting, where the creators of a weapon refused to believe the warriors who wielded it. This was the culture clash at the heart of the crisis. The men of Buord trusted their blueprints and slide rules, while the submariners trusted their eyes and their instincts. For the engineers in Newport, the torpedo's depth was a matter of precise physics, governed by a delicate hydrostatic valve that had performed perfectly in controlled tests. For the commanders in the Pacific, depth was a matter of life and death, and they knew something was terribly wrong. But their voices were being drowned out by the static of bureaucratic pride. The system was designed to trust the designers, not the users. That is, until the problem landed on the desk of Rear Admiral Charles A. Lockwood. In mid-1942, Lockwood took command of submarines in the Southwest Pacific, and he was a different breed of leader. He wasn't a desk admiral. He was a submariner to his core, a submariner's submariner who had spent years prowling the depths himself. He knew the claustrophobic tension of a submerged attack, and more importantly, he knew his men. He had trained many of them. He had served with them. And when decorated commanders like Mush, Morton, and Dud Walker, men with ice in their veins and impeccable records, all told him the same story, he believed them. His leadership philosophy was simple, yet radical for the time. Listen to your people. Frustrated by Buord's stonewalling, Lockwood decided to do the unthinkable. He would conduct his own test, without authorization and in direct violation of protocol. It was a risky move that could have ended his career. On the 21st of June 1942, off the coast of Australia, he ordered a brilliantly simple, low-cost experiment devised by his chief of staff. They requisitioned a large fishing net and strung it between two poles, setting the top of the net at the water's surface. Then, they set a Mark 14 torpedo with a practice warhead, of course to run at a depth of 10 feet, and fired it directly at the net. If Buord was right, the torpedo should have passed cleanly through the center of the net. The result was immediate and undeniable. The torpedo did not hit the net. Instead, it passed clean underneath it. They tried again, adjusting the net lower and lower. Shot after shot yielded the same result. Finally, they conducted a definitive test. They fired 5 torpedoes, all set for a 10-foot depth. Not a single one touched the net. Instead, they found 5 neat holes ripped in the sand of the seabed far below it. Lockwood's simple, ingenious test proved what his commanders had been screaming for months. The torpedoes were running, on average, a full 11 feet deeper than they were set for. The hydrostatic controls were flawed. Faced with this irrefutable physical evidence, Buord had no choice. In August of 1942, they grudgingly admitted the depth-keeping mechanism was faulty and issued new calibration instructions to the fleet. It was a major victory for Lockwood and his men, a validation of their skill and experience. A wave of relief washed over the submarine force. They felt that finally, the fatal flaw had been found and fixed. Now, their miracle weapon would finally work as promised. But as they sailed back into the fight with their newly calibrated torpedoes, they were about to discover that fixing one problem had only unmasked another, far more insidious ghost in the machine. With the depth problem finally solved, a collective sigh of relief echoed through the steel hulls of the Pacific submarine fleet. Skippers and crews, emboldened with renewed confidence, sailed back into the fray, certain that their primary weapon was no longer a liability. They believed the promise of the Mark 14 would at last be fulfilled. But the ocean holds many secrets, and the Mark 14 held more than most. Soon, a new and far more terrifying problem began to surface, one that turned their own weapon into a potential death sentence. Torpedoes began exploding prematurely. Imagine the scene. A submarine has stalked a high-value target for hours, sometimes days, maneuvering into the perfect attack position. It fires. The torpedo races away, a silent hunter. But then, halfway to its target, a massive explosion erupts in the middle of the empty ocean. The blast is enormous, a column of white water and black smoke churning the sea. The target ship, alerted and alarmed, immediately turns away, zigzagging at high speed. Worse, the WWII explosion has just broadcast the submarine's location to every enemy destroyer in the vicinity. The hunter has instantly become the hunted. A terrifying rain of depth charges would often follow, punishing the submarine for an attack that never even had a chance to succeed. The culprit was the sophisticated Mark 6 magnetic exploder. The pride of Buord's engineers was proving to be a catastrophic failure in the real world. The device was too sensitive. A finely tuned instrument, designed in a laboratory, now being subjected to the unpredictable chaos of a global battlefield. It was being triggered by thermal variations in the water, by random metallic objects on the seafloor, and even, it was suspected, by fluctuations in the Earth's own magnetic field near the equator. The ghost in the machine was real, and it was turning on its masters. This issue brought a new, powerful figure into the heart of the conflict. Rear Admiral Ralph Waldo Christie. A brilliant and highly respected officer, Christie was the commander of submarines based in Australia, a parallel command to Lockwood's. But he had a deeply personal connection to the Mark 14. He had spent a significant part of his career championing and developing the very magnetic exploder that was now failing so spectacularly. For Christie, this wasn't just a technical problem. It was a direct assault on his professional legacy and his personal honor. To admit the Mark 6 was a dud was to admit that his life's work had been a failure that was now getting American sailors killed. And so, he refused. While Lockwood listened to his men and challenged the system, Christie defended it. He doubled down. When his own commanders reported premature detonations, he, like Buord, blamed them. He insisted the device was a war winner and that his men simply needed to be better trained in its use. He was a good man blinded by pride, a tragic figure whose inability to separate his ego from the evidence was costing lives. It created a dangerous schism in the Pacific Fleet. Submarines operating under Lockwood were becoming increasingly skeptical of the weapon, while those under Christie were ordered to trust it, despite the terrifying results. The conflict was no longer just between the front lines and Washington. It was now a bitter internal struggle between two admirals with two starkly different philosophies of leadership. By the spring of 1943, the situation had become untenable. The evidence was overwhelming. Too many submarines had been needlessly endangered. Too many prime targets had escaped. The crisis reached the highest levels of command, landing on the desk of the formidable Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, the Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Nimitz was a pragmatist, a man who cared about one thing above all else: results. And the results were clear. The Mark 14 was failing. On the 24th of June 1943, Nimitz issued a decisive, fleet-wide directive that cut through all the arguments and ego. His order was simple and absolute: disable the magnetic exploder on every Mark 14 torpedo. Effective immediately. The order was a thunderclap. For the submarine crews, it was a moment of incredible vindication and profound relief. They felt seen. They felt heard. The High Command had finally sided with the men at the sharp end of the spear. There was a palpable sense of optimism. They had now conquered two demons: the depth flaw and the magnetic ghost. What was left was the simple, reliable contact detonator, the tried-and-true technology that had worked since World War I. They believed, with every fiber of their being, that the nightmare was finally over. Now, they could truly fight. But they were tragically mistaken. In disabling the ghost, they had merely revealed the machine's deepest, most unforgivable sin. The very core of the weapon, the simple mechanism of striking a target and exploding, harbored a fatal secret. And it would take one determined commander, a ship full of failed torpedoes, and an act of furious desperation to finally drag that last, darkest truth into the light. The worst was yet to come. And so we returned to the USS Tinosa on July 24th, 1943, wallowing in the silent, suffocating aftermath of its failed attack. This is the moment the entire narrative has been building towards. Commander DEFIED has done everything by the book, everything the new directives demanded. He had his torpedoes calibrated to the correct depth. He had the faulty magnetic exploders disabled, as ordered by Admiral Nimitz himself. He was relying solely on the simple, supposedly foolproof contact pistol. He had delivered 11 perfect, solid hits on the Tonen Maru III. And for his flawless execution, his reward was the hollow, metallic clank of 9 duds. 9 ghosts that didn't even have the decency to explode. This was the third and most soul-crushing failure. This wasn't a complex system going haywire. This was the simplest part of the weapon, the part that says, when you hit something, explode, failing to do its one job. The scale of the failure was so absolute, so profound, it went beyond mere technical malfunction. It became a deep, psychological wound for the men who witnessed it. What DEFIED and his crew experienced that day wasn't just disappointment. It was a form of trauma military psychologists now call moral injury. Moral injury is the damage done to one's conscience when a person is forced to witness or participate in events that violate their deepest moral beliefs. These submariners believed in their training. They believed in their officers. They believed in the industrial might of the United States and the quality of the weapons it provided them. That day, that faith was irrevocably shattered. They had performed their duty with lethal perfection, only to be betrayed by the very tools they were given. They were forced to watch a critical enemy asset sail away, knowing that the war would be prolonged, and that more of their brothers, in other submarines, would have to pay the price. They were haunted by a terrible question. How many of their friends had already died, not because of a lucky enemy shot, but because their own torpedoes had failed them at the critical moment? It was the feeling of dying for nothing. the feeling of being armed with a lie. When the Tynosa finally limped back to Pearl Harbor, its mission, a total failure. Daspit's report, along with that final, unfired torpedo, landed on the desk of Admiral Charles Lockwood. For Lockwood, this was the final straw. He had fought the bureaucracy on the depth issue and won. He had supported Nimitz's decision to disable the magnetic exploder. He had hoped, like all his men, that the problem was finally solved. Daspit's report was a dagger to the heart of that hope. It was undeniable proof that something was still fundamentally, catastrophically wrong with the core design of the Mark 14. Lockwood was now at a precipice. He had two choices, each with profound consequences. The first was the proper path: follow the chain of command. He could forward Daspit's meticulous report, along with the physical evidence, to the Bureau of Ordnance in Newport and wait for them to act. But he knew, with chilling certainty, what would happen. Buord, having already been forced to admit failure on the depth controls, would never willingly admit a second, even more fundamental flaw. They would find a way to bury the report, to discredit Daspit, to blame freak conditions or poor maintenance. They would form a committee, conduct years of studies in their controlled labs, and all the while, his men would continue to die. The second path was the path of rebellion. He could defy the entire command structure, usurp the authority of the Bureau of Ordnance, and launch his own unsanctioned, completely illegal investigation right there in Pearl Harbor. This was an act of incredible professional risk. He would be using Navy resources without authorization. He would be directly challenging the authority of a powerful and politically connected department. If he failed, or if his insubordination was discovered before he had results, his career would be over. He would be court-martialed, disgraced, and sent home, his name a cautionary tale for any officer who dared to step out of line. For Lockwood, however, the calculation was simple. It was not a choice between his career and the rules. It was a choice between his career and the lives of his men. Looking at the exhausted, betrayed faces of Daspit's crew, he saw the human cost of Buord's arrogance. He saw the ghosts of the submarines already on the bottom of the Pacific, lost perhaps not to enemy action, but to American negligence. He knew that the men in Washington saw this as a problem of engineering and statistics. Lockwood saw it for what it was, a moral crisis. And in a crisis of morality, procedure is no substitute for conscience. He made his decision. The official channels had failed. The experts had failed. The system was broken. So, he would break the system. He would put his entire career, his reputation, and his future on the line, betting everything on his faith in his men. He quietly assembled a small, secret team of his most trusted officers and engineers, his own band of fixers. Their mission was not only to find the flaw in the Mark 14, but to do it quickly, cheaply, and with absolute secrecy. They were about to launch one of the most audacious and consequential investigations of the war. A race against time fought not with guns, but with ingenuity, courage, and a desperate refusal to let another sailor die for a lie. Lockwood's secret team had its mission, but it was a mission that seemed impossible from the start. They were David facing a Goliath of institutional power. The Bureau of Ordnance had multi-million-dollar facilities, the world's top engineers, and 2 decades of research data. Lockwood's team had a few workshops at Pearl Harbor, a handful of determined officers, and a single, dud torpedo. They had no budget, no authority, and no time. Every day they spent investigating was another day. A submarine crew might be lost to a faulty weapon. They knew they couldn't outmuscle Buord. They had to outthink them. The team, led by Lockwood's brilliant torpedo officer, Commander Art Taylor, started by dismantling the contact pistol from Daspit's torpedo, examining every gear and spring. It was a beautifully machined piece of equipment. On the surface, nothing was wrong with it. The problem wasn't a broken part. It was a flaw in the design philosophy itself. They began to question everything they had ever been taught, which led them to a radical, almost heretical hypothesis. In submarine school, every commander was trained that the perfect shot was a 90-degree impact, hitting the target squarely on its side. It provided the shortest running distance for the torpedo and the largest possible target area. It was doctrine. It was gospel. But the men on the Tinosa had made 11 of these perfect shots, and 9 had failed. What if, the team wondered, perfection was the enemy? What if the immense, head-on force of a 90-degree impact was somehow disabling the firing mechanism? It was a wild theory that went against years of naval doctrine, but it was the only one that fit the horrifying facts. The challenge now was how to prove it. They couldn't fire torpedoes at captured ships. That was too expensive and time-consuming. They needed to find a way to replicate the brutal physics of a torpedo strike, simply and effectively. What they came up with was an act of pure, unadulterated American ingenuity, a solution born from the kind of battlefield resourcefulness that has defined the nation's military history. They couldn't bring the target to the torpedo, so they would bring the torpedo to the target. Their plan was audacious. They took live, unarmed torpedo warheads, the same ones that had failed to detonate, and brought them to a construction crane at the submarine base. They would hoist a warhead to a specific height and then simply drop it, nose first, onto a thick steel plate, simulating the kinetic energy of an impact at sea. Their first tests were from 25 feet. They dropped the warhead, and the firing mechanism worked perfectly. The firing pin snapped forward, just as it was designed to do. This explained why angled hits, which had less direct force, sometimes worked. But they knew the force of a direct, 90-degree hit from a torpedo traveling at over 40 knots was far more violent. They needed to simulate the full, crushing power of a perfect shot. So they raised the crane higher and higher, all the way up to 90 feet. From the height of a 9-story building, they released the warhead. It plummeted downwards, a silver dart screaming towards the steel plate below. The impact was catastrophic, a deafening boom of metal on metal that echoed across the harbor. The team rushed in to examine the mangled warhead. They carefully disassembled the firing pistol, and there, before their very eyes, was the truth. The smoking gun. The internal mechanism was a horrifying wreck. The firing pin was mounted on a heavy steel carriage that was supposed to slide forward on impact. But the sheer G-force of the 90-foot drop, a perfect simulation of a 90-degree hit, had been so immense that the heavy carriage had buckled under its own inertia. The delicate guide studs that held it in place were bent and distorted, jamming the entire assembly solid. The firing pin had been stopped dead in its tracks, frozen just fractions of an inch from the percussion cap that would have triggered the main charge. The torpedo had been built too well, its parts too heavy. The very robustness of its construction was its fatal flaw. The team ran the test again and again. The results were consistent and sickening. At a 90-degree impact angle, the mechanism failed an estimated 70% of the time. The revelation was stunning in its tragic irony. The perfect shot that every submarine commander had been trained for, the very pinnacle of their tactical art, was the one most likely to fail. They had been meticulously trained to ensure their own defeat. Every textbook they had studied, every drill they had practiced, was based on a lie. They finally understood the full, horrifying scope of the problem. It wasn't just a matter of depth settings or sensitive fuses. The Mark 14 torpedo was, at its very core, a fundamentally broken weapon. Lockwood now had his proof, undeniable and damning. But it was proof obtained from an illegal, backyard experiment that the bureaucracy in Washington would never accept. He couldn't afford to write a report and wait months for Bureau to debate and deny his findings. His men were out there, right now, lining up perfect shots on Japanese ships, dying because they were doing their jobs exactly as they had been taught. The time for investigation was over. The time for action was now. Lockwood had to make his most dangerous decision yet to move from secret investigator to battlefield manufacturer. Lockwood now possessed a terrible and dangerous truth. He knew precisely why the Mark 14 was failing, but this knowledge was a secret, born from an unsanctioned experiment. Going through official channels was not an option. The Bureau of Ordnance would spend months, if not years, debating his team's crude 90-foot drop test. They would demand peer reviews, controlled studies, and endless paperwork. It was a bureaucratic process designed for peacetime, not for the brutal urgency of a war where men were dying every single day. Lockwood understood that for his men, justice delayed was justice denied. He was done asking for permission. In an act of audacious defiance, he decided to completely bypass Washington. He would not just identify the problem. He would design, manufacture, and implement the solution himself. Right there, in the heart of the Pacific Theater, he turned to his secret team and gave them their most impossible mission yet: fix the firing pin mechanism. The flaw was clear. The heavy steel firing pin and its carriage had too much inertia. The solution, in theory, was simple: make them lighter. Lighter parts would have less inertia and wouldn't buckle the guide rails on a hard 90-degree impact. The question was, how? They didn't have access to advanced metallurgy labs or custom fabrication shops. The answer was waiting for them in a scrap heap. Pearl Harbor was littered with the wreckage of war, a vast graveyard of twisted metal from both American and Japanese forces. A young, innovative officer on the team, Lieutenant E.A. Johnson, had a stroke of genius. He suggested they fabricate new, lighter firing pins out of aluminum. But not just any aluminum. He proposed they use a high-strength aluminum alloy scavenged from the propellers of a downed Japanese aircraft. The symbolism was as powerful as the engineering was brilliant. They would take the remnants of an enemy weapon, a symbol of Japanese aggression, and reforge it into the very component that would fix America's most broken weapon. It was the ultimate act of turning an enemy's strength against them. Lockwood gave the order. The submarine tender USS Holland, a massive floating workshop designed to repair ships at sea, was secretly converted into a makeshift torpedo factory. Machinists worked around the clock in sweltering conditions, milling down the scavenged Japanese propellers to create new, lightweight firing pins. They didn't have official blueprints or schematics. They were working off battlefield intuition and improvised designs sketched on the back of napkins. They called their creation the Mark I fix. It was a classic American story of grit and ingenuity, a testament to the idea that when the system fails, the people on the ground will find a way. While the secret factory was churning out the new parts, Lockwood's team performed one final, crucial test. They needed to be absolutely certain their fix would work. They reassembled a torpedo warhead with the new, lightweight aluminum firing pin and hauled it back to the 90-foot crane. With the fate of the entire submarine campaign resting on this single moment, they let it drop. The warhead slammed into the steel plate with the same bone-jarring force as before. The crew held their breath as they disassembled the mechanism. Inside, everything was perfect. The lighter aluminum pin had slid forward flawlessly, striking the percussion cap with precision. The guide rails were unharmed. The fix worked. The last week of September 1943 was a moment of quiet, revolutionary change. Without any announcement from Washington, without any official change in doctrine, submarines began to slip out of Pearl Harbor, armed with what the crews called Lockwood's torpedoes. The first boat to carry these modified weapons into combat was the USS Barb. Her skipper was briefed on the findings. Aim for the 90-degree shot. Trust the weapon. The effect was immediate, electrifying, and decisive. The USS Barb and the submarines that followed began to sink enemy ships at a rate that was previously unimaginable. The frustrating clanks of duds were replaced by the thunderous roar of successful hits. Ship after ship, from destroyers to vital tankers, was sent to the bottom of the Pacific. The silent service was silent no more. The news spread like wildfire through the submarine fleet, a wave of renewed hope and vicious lethality. The change was so dramatic that it showed up in the cold, hard statistics of war. In 1944, with the fleet now fully equipped with reliable torpedoes, U.S. submarines would sink over 6 million tons of Japanese shipping, more than all previous years of the war combined. They were finally strangling Japan's war effort, cutting off its oil and supplies, just as they were always meant to do. The technical war over the Mark 14 had been won. It was won not by the experts in their pristine laboratories, but by a handful of defiant men with a crane, a fishing net, and a piece of enemy scrap. But as the tide of the war began to turn, a final question remained. A moral reckoning was due. What was the ultimate cost of those 21 months of institutional failure? And who, if anyone, would be held accountable for a scandal that had cost so much in treasure and so much more in blood? The story of the Mark 14 torpedo doesn't end with the battlefield fix. It ends with a sobering look at its legacy, a legacy written in statistics, in blood, and in the timeless lessons of leadership it provides. With their weapons finally working, the U.S. submarine force went on a rampage that crippled the Japanese empire. They strangled the flow of oil and raw materials to the home islands, effectively starving the Japanese war machine. Historians can debate the precise impact, but it is widely believed that the actions of the submarine fleet, once armed with reliable torpedoes, significantly shortened the war in the Pacific, potentially saving hundreds of thousands of lives, both American and Japanese, that would have been lost in a prolonged conflict or a full-scale invasion of Japan. But this victory came at a horrific cost. The 21 months of failure, from the first reports of deep-running torpedoes to Lockwood's battlefield fix, were a catastrophic waste. During that period, U.S. submarines fired thousands of torpedoes. An estimated 80% of them failed to perform as designed. Consider the resources wasted. Billions of dollars in today's money spent on useless ordnance. Consider the strategic losses. Countless high-value enemy targets that escaped to fight another day, prolonging the war. Most tragically, consider the human cost. The U.S. submarine force was a small, elite community, yet it suffered the highest casualty rate of any branch of the U.S. military in World War II. 52 submarines and 3,506 submariners were lost. 1 in 5 who went out on patrol never came home. We will never know the exact number, but it is a chilling certainty that a significant portion of those men and their boats were lost not because they were outfought, but because their weapons failed them at the decisive moment. They died because of a chain of failure that began with peacetime budget cuts and culminated in institutional arrogance. They died because the men in charge of building their weapons refused to believe the men who had to use them. And what of the Bureau of Ordnance? After the war, faced with the overwhelming evidence of Lockwood's success, they quietly incorporated his team's fixes into the design of new torpedoes. They eventually, reluctantly, acknowledged that there had been difficulties with the Mark 14's development. But there was no public apology. No one was court-martialed. No one was fired. The institution investigated itself and, unsurprisingly, found itself largely blameless. The system protected its own, and the scandal was quietly buried in the archives of history. The true legacy, then, belongs not to the bureaucracy, but to the rebels. It belongs to men like Commander Lawrence Daspit, whose furious integrity compelled him to bring back the evidence. And above all, it belongs to Admiral Charles Lockwood. He was not a flashy or famous admiral, but his leadership provides one of the most powerful case studies taught in military academies to this day. His philosophy was a radical departure from the top-down command structure of his time, and it contains 3 essential truths that are more relevant today than ever. First, trust your people on the front lines. The sailors firing the torpedoes knew the weapon was broken long before the engineers in the lab did. Experience in the real world will always trump theory in a controlled environment. Leaders who don't listen to the people doing the work are destined to fail. Second, test under realistic conditions. The greatest sin of the Mark 14 was that it was never tested in the same way it would be used. A decision made to save a few $1,000s on a live warhead test ultimately cost the nation billions of dollars and thousands of lives. The true cost of not testing is measured in blood. And third, and most importantly, true leadership requires moral courage. Lockwood risked his entire career, his reputation, and the threat of disgrace, because he knew it was the right thing to do. He placed the lives of his men above the rules of the bureaucracy. He understood that a leader's primary responsibility is not to the system, but to the people they lead. The story of the Mark 14 torpedo is more than a history lesson. It is a timeless cautionary tale. The arrogance of Buord, the refusal to listen, the defense of a flawed system simply because that's how we've always done it. These are not relics of the 1940 seconds. They exist today in corporate boardrooms, in government offices, in every organization where the voices from the field are ignored by the decision-makers in headquarters. So we leave you with this question. Who is the Buord in your world? Is there a critical truth being ignored in your workplace, your community, or your life because of pride, ego, or a fear of challenging the status quo? We would be honored to hear your story. Please share in the comments below a time when you had to fight to make your voice heard against a rigid system. Your experience could be the spark of courage for someone else facing their own impossible investigation. Thank you for joining us on this journey into a forgotten chapter of history. And if you believe these stories need to be told, please subscribe and help us continue to bring them into the light.